You know, reflecting on the last few weeks, that horrific attack in Pahalgam in late April, then India's swift Operation Sindoor just a couple of weeks later, and then this sudden hush with the ceasefire on May 10th. It really makes you think.
And it really does. It felt incredibly tense for a while there.
Yeah. Forget the chest thumping and the military parades for a second. What actually made both sides, you know, pump the brakes before things went completely over the edge?
That's the key question, isn't it?
It's the knot we're trying to untangle today.
It's a fascinating puzzle. I mean, the Kashmir issue has been a smoldering fire for decades, always threatening to erupt.
Oh, it is.
But this particular brush with all-out war felt different, almost inevitable for a moment there.
Uh-huh.
What's truly interesting, I think, is how a confluence of very real-world limitations, economic vulnerabilities being perhaps the most critical,
Right.
alongside the stark military realities, and yes, some delicate diplomatic footwork ultimately prevented the worst.
So a mix of factors.
Definitely. We've been digging through the layers, and our aim today is to really understand why Pakistan, at this specific juncture, simply couldn't sustain a full-scale conflict.
Okay, let's plunge straight into what feels like the biggest constraint then. Pakistan's economic situation.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to fight a war when you're already deep in debt and struggling to pay the bills. It's like trying to sprint a marathon with your shoelaces tied together.
That's a great analogy. It really captures it. When you look at their external debt, a staggering $130 billion. That's not just a big number, it's a significant anchor dragging them down.
$130 billion. Wow.
And when you consider that over, what, $26 billion of that is owed to China.
Right, I saw that.
It's not just about the money. It's about the strategic dependencies that come with it, Would Beijing be thrilled to see a regional conflict escalate that could destabilize their investments? Probably not.
And unlikely, yeah.
Then you have their foreign exchange reserves, a meager $15 billion.
15, that sounds incredibly low.
It is. To put that in perspective, that's barely enough to cover essential imports for about 3 months.
3 months?
Think about running your household and having only enough money for maybe a week's groceries when you need to feed your family for the entire month. The math just doesn't work. It's unsustainable.
And it sounds like the immediate pressure was immense, too, with that $22 billion in public external debt maturing soon, including a hefty $13 billion in bilateral deposits.
Exactly. That's a huge bill coming due right when tensions are at their absolute highest.
Talk about bad timing.
It creates a perfect storm of financial anxiety, and this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? You have a persistent trade deficit, meaning more money is flowing out than in.
Uh-huh.
Tax revenues are low, unemployment is high, and inflation is making everyday essentials incredibly expensive for ordinary people.
So it's not just about financing a war machine.
No, it's about the basic functioning of the state. Even Moody's, the ratings agency, flagged it. They warned that any military escalation would be catastrophic, tanking any hope of economic recovery and scaring away desperately needed foreign investment.
So the markets were watching closely, too.
Absolutely. War, at its heart, is incredibly expensive. You need fuel, ammunition, maintenance, personnel, and Pakistan was already, well, running on fumes.
It's such a contrast with India's economic trajectory, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, no economy is bulletproof, but the fact that 170 million people were lifted out of poverty in the decade leading up to 2022,
Yeah.
that says something.
It speaks volumes about the underlying strength, yeah. And the projections for continued growth are relatively solid for India.
It's almost a complete reversal. One nation has the capacity to potentially extend aid, while the other is consistently seeking it.
And what's really telling is Pakistan's repeated reliance on the IMF. That $2.3 billion loan approved on May 9th, even with India raising objections, just underscores their desperate need for external support.
Wasn't that just the latest in a long line?
Oh, absolutely. This isn't an isolated incident. Since 1950, they've gone to the IMF for a bailout, a staggering 25 times.
25 times.
Including a substantial $7 billion package just last September. That kind of track record points to really deep-seated structural issues that would make financing a war, well, an almost insurmountable challenge.
It paints a picture of an economy so fragile that, like, even sneezing too hard could knock it over, metaphorically speaking.
It's a good way to put it.
To even contemplate war in that state seems less like a strategic decision and more like an act of sheer desperation almost.
Precisely. It's like trying to compete in a world-class weightlifting competition with a broken arm. The desire might be there, maybe the rhetoric is there, but the fundamental capacity is simply absent.
Okay, so the economic reality for Pakistan looks incredibly precarious. Now, let's pivot to the military equation. because that feels like the other big piece here.
Definitely.
It feels like the balance of power there also played a significant role in preventing a larger conflict.
Yeah, if we shift our focus to the military capabilities, thinking about a significant power imbalance is probably the most accurate way to frame it.
Okay.
Both sides have invested in modernizing their forces since, say, 2019, no question about that. But the underlying disparity in resources is just
We're
enormous.
talking about sophisticated air power on both sides.
Yeah.
India's Rafale jets armed with those long-range Meteor missiles versus Pakistan's J-10 fighters with their PL-15s.
Right, advanced stuff.
And both have been bolstering their air defenses, too. S-400s for India, HQ-9s for Pakistan.
Correct. But what's critical to grasp is the sheer scale of difference in defense spending. In 2024, India allocated over $81 billion to its military.
81 million.
Compare that to Pakistan's $7.3 billion.
7.3. Wow, that's
It's a more than 10-to-1 ratio.
huge.
And it's not just about having more planes or tanks, you know? It impacts everything: training, maintenance, the ability to sustain prolonged operations, replace equipment losses.
The whole logistical tale.
Exactly. It's like one side is equipped with, I don't know, Ferraris,
Yeah.
and the other is trying to keep up with a secondhand scooter. This kind of gap severely limits Pakistan's ability to wage a sustained conventional war.
Now, Pakistan does possess nuclear weapons, obviously. And we heard some pretty strong rhetoric from their army chief about being ready to use full force.
Mm-hmm.
But that feels like pulling the fire alarm at a family reunion, doesn't it? A totally different level.
Absolutely. This brings up the crucial issue of nuclear deterrence. While Pakistan's nuclear arsenal undoubtedly serves as a deterrent, its use would be an absolute last resort.
You'd hope so.
A catastrophic decision with unimaginable consequences for everyone involved. In terms of conventional conflict, though, Pakistan's limitations are stark. Their ability to maintain logistics, fuel, ammo, spare parts is heavily reliant on those already critically low foreign currency reserves we talked about.
Back to the economy again.
Always. A protracted conventional war would quickly deplete their resources, leaving them in an extremely vulnerable position.
Which is, again, a
Yeah.
stark contrast with India. Their much larger economy and more developed industrial base mean they have a far greater capacity to endure a longer conflict,
Right.
to replenish supplies.
Precisely. India has the economic depth to absorb the costs and sustain a longer military engagement in a way that Pakistan simply cannot contemplate at this point. Moreover, you have to remember, Pakistan's military is already significantly stretched. They're dealing with ongoing security challenges along the border with Afghanistan, persistent separatist movements in Balochistan.
So they're already fighting on other fronts, essentially.
Exactly. To open up another major front with India would be an enormous overextension of their already limited resources. It's like trying to spread a very thin layer of butter across a massive piece of toast. It just won't cover it.
It really paints a clear picture of a significant military disadvantage for Pakistan. Almost like asking a small street food vendor to suddenly cater a massive royal wedding.
That's a good analogy, too. The scale of the undertaking is just overwhelming compared to the available resources.
So we have this precarious economy, this military imbalance. Then comes the spark.
Yes, the immediate trigger. What's particularly interesting is how this underlying economic and military imbalance intersected with this specific event. That terrible terrorist attack in Pahalgam on April 22nd.
Killing 27 people, including tourists of different faiths. Just awful.
Truly awful. And the deliberate targeting of tourists was clearly a calculated attempt to inflame tensions and sow sectarian division within Kashmir. The Resistance Front, TRF, claimed it, but India pointed the finger squarely at Pakistan for sponsoring terrorism.
Which Pakistan denied, calling for an international inquiry, as they often do.
Right. But India's response with Operation Sindoor was not only swift, it was also geographically significant, hitting 9 sites, including that mosque seminary in Muzaffarabad, but also targets in Pakistan's Punjab province.
That was a big deal, wasn't it? The first time hitting Punjab since '71.
A very strong message, yes. And it immediately escalated things.
You could see it happening in real time.
Pakistan's reaction, denouncing it as an act of war, claiming 26 civilian deaths, while India insisted they hit terrorist infrastructure, it just ratcheted up the rhetoric instantly.
And then the claims about downed jets.
Yes, Pakistan claiming they downed 5 Indian jets, including a Rafale, which India strongly contested, confirming 3 crashes, but saying they were in Indian territory due to technical issues or possibly ground fire, not air-to-air combat.
A classic fog of war situation, maybe.
Definitely. Plus the artillery exchanges along the line of control, the tragic civilian casualties, people displaced from their homes.
And air travel disruption, too, right?
Yeah.
India closed dozens of airports.
Yeah. 27 airports closed in northern India, international carriers rerouting flights, all pointing towards a very dangerous and rapid slide into something much bigger.
And you could really sense the intense domestic pressure on both sides, couldn't you?
Absolutely. In India, there was palpable public demand for a decisive response after Pahalgam. You just couldn't ignore that.
And in Pakistan.
Well, the government, already not hugely popular and with the military holding significant influence, couldn't afford to look weak, especially after those strikes deep inside Punjab. They had to react strongly.
So internal politics pushing them towards confrontation.
Which raises that critical point about the inherent contradictions. Both governments engaged in strong public posturing, for their domestic audiences, projecting strength.
Right.
But Pakistan was doing this under the immense weight of its precarious economic situation. It's like two kids arguing over the last slice of pizza, but the pizza is a mountain range, and one kid barely has the energy to stand up. The risks were astronomically high.
So with the world watching, holding its breath, how did we actually get to that ceasefire on May 10th? It seemed to come together pretty quickly in the end.
It did. And international concern was definitely a factor. You had UN Secretary General Guterres giving that stark warning, a conflict the world couldn't afford. Calls for restraint from China, France, Russia. Major powers were worried.
They usually are when two nuclear states start firing shells.
Understandably so. And then, somewhat unexpectedly, you had U.S. President Donald Trump announcing the ceasefire.
On social media, no less.
Yeah.
That was certainly a distinctive approach to high-stakes international diplomacy.
Yes. Quite distinctive. But the ceasefire itself, effective from 5:00 p.m. IST that day, it came after a direct phone call between the Directors General of Military Operations, the DGMOs of both countries.
So the military hotline was working, at least.
It seems so. And while the official statements from the foreign ministers on both sides afterwards were, pretty standard, reiterating their position.
Covering their bases.
Exactly. But the key thing was the agreement to hold further talks. It signaled a mutual, albeit perhaps reluctant, recognition that they needed to step back from the brink. For now, anyway.
And the primary catalyst for Pakistan agreeing to de-escalate. It really seems to circle back to that crippling economic vulnerability, doesn't it? You just keep coming back to it.
I think you have to. A prolonged military conflict would have been financially devastating for Pakistan. It would have risked angering key creditors like China, put those vital IMF loans in even greater jeopardy.
And wasn't there something about water as well?
Yes, that was another huge pressure point. India suspended the Indus Waters Treaty.
Wow, that's a massive lever to pull, threatening their water supply.
An immense and immediate pressure adding to everything else.
And it appears the U.S., despite the unconventional public announcements, still played a role behind the scenes.
It seems so. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed back-channel talks were happening. So even with Trump's different style, traditional diplomacy was still at play, creating that space for de-escalation.
So Pakistan saw an off-ramp.
Essentially, yes. Pakistan, acutely aware of its severe limitations, basically seized the opportunity provided by these diplomatic efforts to step back from a conflict it simply couldn't afford to fight.
It's almost surreal, isn't it? Trump tweeting about a ceasefire feels a bit like your uncle suddenly announcing world peace at Thanksgiving dinner.
Perhaps. Unexpected, maybe a little bizarre, but ultimately, in this case, the outcome was de-escalation, which everyone wanted.
Okay, but we can't discuss this near conflict without addressing the elephant in the room, or rather, the mushroom cloud in the room.
The nuclear shadow, absolutely.
That 2019 study, the one predicting a potential nuclear war scenario around 2025, triggered by a terror attack that felt disturbingly relevant these past few weeks.
Chillingly relevant. And the casualty projections in that study were just horrifying to contemplate. Millions dead.
Thankfully, it didn't come to that. The general consensus among military experts seems to be that neither side would want to initiate nuclear war unless facing an existential threat, right?
That's the prevailing wisdom. But the danger is that even a limited conventional conflict carries that terrifying, unpredictable risk of escalation. Miscalculation, accident, desperation.
Especially with Pakistan. There have always been background worries about the security of their arsenal, haven't there? Past attacks on facilities, the potential for rogue elements.
That's a deeply concerning point, yes. It creates a very dangerous dynamic. And paradoxically, India's clear conventional superiority, while meant as a deterrent, could potentially increase the temptation for Pakistan to consider a nuclear response if they felt they were on the verge of a catastrophic conventional defeat. It's a very delicate, dangerous balance.
But Pakistan actually rattling the nuclear saber, or worse, using even a tactical nuke? That feels like a move that would bring the whole world down on them.
Oh, absolutely. If we look at the bigger picture, any credible indication of nuclear use or even serious threats from Pakistan would almost certainly trigger severe international sanctions, alienate even close allies like China,
It would mean total isolation.
and likely complete economic collapse on top of the immediate devastation. While India, with its larger economy, might theoretically weather the international fallout better, a nuclear conflict remains an absolute lose-lose scenario, no winners.
It's like having that friend who always threatens to delete their social media during an argument. It's dramatic, but you really, really hope they never actually push the button because it's irreversible.
A good comparison. The stakes are infinitely higher, of course, but the principle of mutually assured destruction, or at least mutually assured catastrophe, still holds.
So beyond the hard economics and the military math, we have to remember the human cost in all this, don't we?
We absolutely must. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitics, but the tragic loss of life in the Pahalgam attack, the families shattered.
And the civilians caught in the crossfire afterwards.
Yes, the civilian casualties from the retaliatory strikes, the shelling along the line of control, the people forced to flee their homes. These aren't just statistics. The reported strike on the mosque seminary in Muzaffarabad, civilian deaths in Poonch. These are real people, real suffering.
And the diplomatic fallout has been significant too, hasn't it? We mentioned the Indus Waters Treaty suspension by India, a huge deal.
Huge implications. And Pakistan's strong reaction, understandably, just highlights the deep-seated animosity. Then you have the tit-for-tat expulsions of diplomats, suspending visa processes, cutting off already limited trade.
Which, again, probably hurts Pakistan's struggling economy more.
Disproportionately so, yes.
And you mentioned earlier how social media played a role.
Yeah, it's particularly noteworthy and worrying. Social media seemed to fuel public anger and propagate misinformation on both sides. You saw exaggerated reports in some Indian media, aggressive online trolling from Pakistani accounts.
Creating an echo chamber of outrage.
Exactly. And this digital noise amplified tensions and made it even harder for Pakistan's government, already politically vulnerable, to manage de-escalation without looking weak domestically.
It really does feel like this entire episode, the build-up, the strikes, the near war, it was like watching a really bad Bollywood sequel. Lots of noise, dramatic moments, but ultimately something everyone involved probably just wishes they could forget.
Haha, maybe so. A sequel nobody asked for. So when we step back and look at the whole picture, the reasons why Pakistan simply could not afford a full-scale war with India become starkly clear.
Let's summarize them.
Okay. First, the economy was teetering on the edge of collapse. Second, their military was significantly outmatched and lacked the resources, the money, the fuel, the ammo for a sustained conflict.
Right.
And third, they lacked the kind of robust financial or strategic support from allies like China or others that would have been absolutely necessary to weather that kind of storm.
So the ceasefire.
Hmm.
It was driven by necessity more than anything else.
It really feels that way, more a result of sheer necessity than a genuine resolution of the underlying tensions.
And Kashmir. It just remains that deeply entrenched, incredibly volatile flashpoint, doesn't it?
It does. And without meaningful steps to adjust the route, causes the persistent issue of cross-border terrorism that India raises, the profound and long-standing mistrust on both sides, the fundamentally competing claims over the territory. It feels like we are just perpetually waiting for the next crisis to erupt.
So what needs to happen? Is crisis management enough?
Well, arguably, no. If we consider the broader implications, there's a clear need for the international community, maybe, to shift focus from just reacting to crises to proactively working towards preventing them, exploring concrete pathways for normalizing relations, maybe through increased trade eventually, fostering consistent dialogue at all levels, not just when things blow up, implementing robust confidence-building measures. These could be critical.
But that shifting power dynamic complicates things, right?
Yeah.
India rising, Pakistan struggling.
It adds a very complex layer, absolutely. It
Mm,
underscores the immediate pressing need for Pakistan to get its economic house in order somehow,
yeah,
and perhaps for India to exercise strategic restraint and diplomatic maturity,
yeah.
even from its position of relative strength.
It's a tough balance.
Extremely. Which brings us back to the ceasefire. For now, it holds, but it feels undeniably fragile. It's like those two neighbors who've been throwing rocks at each other finally agreeing to stop.
At least until someone finds a bigger rock.
Yeah. Exactly. Let's sincerely hope they can find a more sustainable path forward through genuine dialogue rather than continuing down this dangerous path.
Absolutely. And it leaves you contemplating, doesn't it, the long-term consequences of such a stark, imbalanced economic, military in a region with nuclear weapons. What kind of future security challenges might that imbalance create, even if it's not traditional state-on-state war?
It's definitely a sobering thought to carry forward. What does regional stability look like under these conditions? That's a question with no easy answers.